How's it hanging out there, YouTube land? Happy Tuesday to you, folks. Welcome to Burn It Down with Kim Brown here on the Real News Network. Looking forward to a fantastic show. We appreciate everyone who is standing by and joining us today for our discussion about drugs. Drugs! Who doesn't love to talk about drugs? That was the real winner of election 2020, to be honest, because as we know, the presidential outcome is still, it's not in limbo, but it is kind of in limbo. The Senate races are still outstanding, especially that runoff in Georgia. Most things got decided, but the best news we can take away from election 2020 is that marijuana and mushrooms did the damn thing on a number of state ballots. Why is this important? Well, for one, if drugs are legal, these drugs especially, it gives police fewer things to do, right? So it is a bolstering to the defund slash abolish the police argument because we know that police have spent a large amount of the last, say, 40 years enforcing the war on drugs, which has been so detrimental to a number of communities, especially Black and Brown communities, and affecting people's overall life in a very, very harmful way. Oregon, the state of Oregon actually went a step further and decided to decriminalize small amounts of all drugs, even the hard drugs, which is amazing. We're going to get a little explainer about that from Oregon Public Media. So I'm very much looking forward to that. But we're also today going to talk about how, despite the legalization and decriminalization of drugs in over 30 plus states across this country, why is it that Black and Brown people are still being targeted for criminal penalties by police? If the shit is legal, you got to leave the people alone. But for some reason, the police are finding opportunities to still go after Black folks and Brown folks and Indigenous folks and target them from drugs. I mean, I guess old habits are just hard to break. And they've been doing it for so long. Why stop now? These silly laws be damned. So we're going to be speaking with Neill Franklin. You guys know Neill Franklin, friend of the show, executive director of law enforcement Action Partnership. Neill is former law enforcement, and he has been working very diligently to change the culture of police. We're going to speak with Neill about that. But first, I'd like to introduce our first guest on the program today. First of all, let me shout out everyone that's in the chat and the comments. Hello. Thank y'all so much for coming by, hanging out. Do me a favor. When you get a chance, go over to Burn It Down with Kim Brown, that YouTube page. Click and subscribe for your homie. If it's not too much trouble, click like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to introduce our first guest for today. You guys know NORML, right? National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Well, Carly Wolf coordinates state policies for NORML. She's also she serves as NORML's state policy coordinator, and she tracks and analyzes hundreds of pieces of marijuana related legislation across the country. And Carly has made some time to join us here and sort of bring us up to speed on the different victories that marijuana made over this past election cycle. So, Carly, we appreciate you making some time for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Kim. I'm super excited to be here and talk about all the great things that happened this election.
Well, let's talk about them. I feel like the first place we should start is really every place, because some of the places that marijuana made some strides, both on the medicinal front and the recreational front, some of these spots are like long held, like conservative bastions, right? Places that we weren't ever sure if marijuana would break through, like Arizona and like Mississippi. Talk to us about where marijuana made wins and made gains on election day.
Sure. So yeah, this election, it was pretty clear that if anything, marijuana definitely came out on top. Like you said, we saw marijuana initiatives passed in deep red states to deep blue states across the country. And I think it's important to note not only did all of the measures that were on the ballot marijuana related pass, but they passed with higher margins of support than we've ever seen before. So I think that that's something to note this year, as we saw, um, record levels of voter turnout, and I think it goes to show how nonpartisan this issue is. You know, people from across all sides of the aisle support this issue. For example, we had actually South Dakota made some history this election because they were the only state to go from having marijuana completely criminalized, not even any medical access or CBD access. So they went to fully illegal to now full recreationally legal. So South Dakota actually voted on two separate measures, one medical marijuana measure and a separate recreational legalization measure, and both of them passed. So we were really excited to see that happen in South Dakota, especially since going into the election, the polling was very close, so we weren't sure how much support there actually was for it, but it ended up passing with a higher margin than we ever expected.
And, and
Um,
really quick, something interesting about South Dakota, because I was doing some research in this. First of all, shout out to the Oglala Sioux tribe because they legalized marijuana for recreational and medicinal use earlier this year. And really, regardless of what the state of South Dakota ended up doing, the Sioux were going to keep moving forward and actually create. At least it was reported on this website. I think it's called 500 Nations. I was reading about it that the Oglala Sioux were planning on starting their own pot resort, which they probably will still do anyway, since the measure passed tribally and now in the greater state of South Dakota. So I just wanted to shout out the indigenous folks there who were leading the charge on this very progressive measure. But by all means, please, Carly, keep going, keep going.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I know we talked about this a little bit before the show, but you know, those indigenous people and black and brown people are the ones that, you know, in non-legal states and even in states that are already legal, you know, those are the people that are targeted for the enforcement of these policies disproportionately. So I think it's really awesome to see the Sioux Oglala move forward first before the rest of the states. So that was really cool to see.
What
Um,
did Montana do?
so Montana also legalized adult use marijuana. That was another state that we were optimistic that it was going to pass. It was polling in the low 50s, but it ended up passing with, I think it was closer to 60% support. What was the final number? 57% yes, and only 43% no. So Montana would legalize possession and use and retail sales for adults over 21, and that also includes the right for adults to grow a small number of plants in their own home. So that's happening in Montana, and I believe that goes into effect in January. So I'm really interested to see how their program rolls out because I think Montana is another one of those states that, you know, historically lawmakers refused to act. And so the citizens took it upon themselves to, you know, collect signatures and meet all the criteria to get this initiative on the ballot. And there was actually two separate initiatives, one that legalized the use and possession, and then because Montana's constitution defines adults as 18, they wanted to make sure that, you know, just as all the other legal states have their laws on the books, that it was only for those 21 and older. So that's why they had to have two separate measures for that. But yeah, marijuana is now legal for all adults in Montana, which is cool.
That's amazing. And in terms of what Arizona did, they also went full legalization for adults 21 and older.
Yeah, so Prop 207 was the measure that passed in Arizona that also had record turnout, and that was probably the highest margin that we've seen legalization pass to this date, even a higher margin than California back in, what was it? I think the first state, or Washington and Colorado were the first back in 2012. But so Arizona was also a bit unique because they had included various social justice provisions, which we really like to see, such as expungement. That's a really important one because now that marijuana is legal, obviously that doesn't mean that people that have convictions on their record, it doesn't mean that they won't still be discriminated against for those convictions. So expungement is a super important part of the law, and that will local prosecutors and district attorneys will be key to that process, to ensuring, that those people that have a criminal record are able to get that wiped clean. Because, of course, it's disproportionately Black and brown people that have these convictions, and, they're discriminated against every day of their lives when it comes to employment, when it comes to, looking for housing. Students are unable to get, aid for higher education if they have a conviction on their record. So the expungement provisions in the Arizona legalization law, I think, are really noteworthy for those reasons too.
And so for the other states that went full on passing for legalization, were there expungement considerations in those measures as well? That
That's a good question, and I think in some of the more conservative states like Montana and South Dakota, that's not always a part of the conversation from the beginning, which it should be, of course. But I think that will definitely be an opportunity for activists to continue their work in the coming years to get those aspects of the law included in the future, because they were not included in the some of the other measures like Montana and South Dakota. But it's super important, like I said. So I'm hoping that we can work on that in next year during the legislative session and in following years to get those kinds of social justice provisions included in the law as well.
Absolutely. Let's turn to the East Coast, where New Jersey, shout out to Dirty Jersey, Jersey came through with the legalization of recreational use of marijuana. A lot of eyes on the East Coast are watching New Jersey very closely. Everyone is assuming it's going to be a turnt summer at the shore, summer 2021. So what are some of the particularities of how New Jersey is going to move forward with recreational sales?
Yeah, so New Jersey was actually unique this year because the ballot measure was technically it was non-binding. So it was placed on the ballot by lawmakers, and now since it passed, also with overwhelming support, the measure there got 67% yes votes, which is also record-breaking. So now it goes back to the lawmakers at the state level to pass legislation to implement the rules and regulations that will govern the industry. So lawmakers in New Jersey are figuring that out right now. There's been hearings going on for the past week or so to implement this legislation. It does not include the right to home cultivate currently, which is something that NORML advocates for actively. But it does include some social justice provisions like expungement, which we like to see. And it also, I think it's important to note that, well, as the bill is now, I guess there's a chance it could be amended before it gets passed into law, but it prohibits law enforcement from using the smell of marijuana as probable cause to search somebody, which is really huge, because just an officer stating that they smell marijuana, even if they don't really technically in the past, would have given them the right to search someone or search their car. So I think that's super important, to reduce those, police community interactions and I guess reduce the number of interactions that elevate to an arrest. So I think that's something to note in Jersey also.
Man, listen, not now, because I'm a big grown up, but when I was younger and we used to take them trips up to Jersey, let me tell you, super paranoid being on the New Jersey
Right.
Turnpike, because everybody knows the New Jersey troopers do not fuck around, the state troopers. So if they
Right.
caught you with something, you were probably going to go down with that. So thank you, New Jersey voters and lawmakers, for having a progressive, forward-thinking mentality on that particular issue. And that's another thing we're going to discuss a little bit later on the show with Neill Franklin, because a lot of states are trying to do it away with that in the courts, at least. Doing away with probable cause for the smell of marijuana by police. So thank you very much for bringing that up. I wanted us to take a quick look, if we could, at Mississippi and Initiative 65. And I pulled a piece from, I believe it's the local ABC affiliate in Mississippi, one of them, that did a pretty interesting report on Ballot Initiative 65, which did end up passing, by the way. Dwayne, let's take a look at that.
Ballot Initiative 65 would establish a medical marijuana program in Mississippi for patients suffering from debilitating medical conditions. The diagnosis would come from a licensed physician, and then the patient would be certified to obtain medical marijuana from a licensed and regulated treatment center. At the state capitol, a full-throated denouncement of Initiative 65 by some members of the legislature and some state officials. State Health Officer Dr. Thomas Dobbs says implementing the 65 program under his agency would pull them away from dealing with coronavirus.
This is the largest pandemic in over a century. We're about to embark on the biggest immunization effort ever in the world. And then we're going to be distracted by this nonsense.
I think that it is shameful that legislators would stand at the state capitol who have blocked every single attempt for medical marijuana. They've blocked more than 20 proposed bills over the last decade for medical marijuana for patients who are suffering here who need it.
Dr. Dobbs, on a Facebook Live taking questions from Mississippians about 65, says he believes the initiative leaves a lot of questions unanswered.
There wouldn't be any sort of strict control over the type of marijuana that's used, the percent THC. Is it going to be a gummy bear? Is it going to be a cookie? Is it going to be a blunt? Or is it going to be something else?
Initiative 65 would set up a conservative, tightly regulated medical marijuana program for patients with debilitating and often incurable diseases like multiple sclerosis, cancer, PTSD.
Jamie Grantham says nearly 250,000 Mississippians got this measure on the ballot because they need it. If 65 passes, Mississippi would join 34 other states across the country that have medical marijuana programs, including nearby states like Arkansas, Louisiana, and Florida.
16 WAPT's Troy Johnson joining us live. And Troy, those opposed to 65 have been saying the measure changes the state constitution.
Yeah, Keegan, that's true. They argue that it will change the state constitution permanently. What they're not saying is that both 65 and 65A would amend the state constitution.
Yes, that video courtesy of WAPT 16 News, and everyone who's in Baltimore, that face looked familiar to you. That was Troy Johnson, Big Fat Morning Show, if you are old enough to remember that. So shout out to Troy, shout out to Baltimore. Carly, what was interesting and what jumped out to me at that package was the Mississippi health official talking about he didn't know enough about the law, which I'm sure he definitely had questions or about the initiative, but at the same time, sort of raising these very sort of tired questions. You know, is it going to be a gummy, a cookie, a slab of ribs, a stick of dynamite? We don't know how the marijuana is coming to us. Do you still see in some of the more states that sort of have draconian approaches towards drug policy in general, like sort of raising like these very like 2000s kind of questions, like, sir, this is 2020. Dozens of states have done this. These questions that you're asking were answered 15 years ago.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring that up because that's such a common practice now, unfortunately. We like to call that reefer madness mentality, that kind of fear mongering and, just propaganda spreading. Unfortunately, that's still prominent among politicians and lawmakers at the state level, especially more conservative politicians that kind of like to spread those myths about marijuana. And Mississippi, their amendment would amend the Constitution, and I think that lawmakers oppose that. And I guess not only do they oppose medical marijuana, but they oppose constitutional amendments specifically because it does give residents that unalienable right in the Constitution, and that means that lawmakers can't go back and amend the law afterwards. So I think that really puts the power in the people's hands, and as it should. And lawmakers shouldn't have the ability to, go against the will of the voters. I mean, Initiative 65 passed with over 70% support. So I think it's kind of shameful that the lawmakers are still, outspokenly against this because, like I think her name was Jamie Grantham. It would only really be for patients with really severe conditions. It's not gonna, just get into the hands of anybody. So it's gonna be tightly regulated, and I think it's not in lawmakers' best interest to go against the will of the voters, especially if they then have the ability to vote them out of office. So I'm interested to see how that medical program unfolds in Mississippi for sure.
And then for that doctor to to say that, oh, we're going to have to delay the coronavirus vaccine rollout to deal with this nonsense. Is that what's really going to happen? Is that what you think is
Yeah,
going to happen?
I don't think so. I feel like it's just two completely separate issues and they can just happen simultaneously like most things do. So yeah, I think politicians, it's not uncommon for especially older white men to kind of spread that propaganda and those lies with the public. So I'm not surprised to see that, but also it's frustrating, seeing this all the time from especially more, conservative lawmakers like that.
Yes, they just sound goofy.
Yeah.
So marijuana did exceedingly well. Mushrooms made a decent showing here. Here, a mile down the road in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. D.C. voters chose to decriminalize mushrooms, magical mushrooms, which is great, I guess. I saw Mayor Bowser's comments about it, even though she was in opposition to this. She did say at a press conference, she was like, well, it's not really a priority for Metropolitan Police anyway to be seeking out people with mushrooms. So she said it was kind of a nothing burger. But what happened out in Oregon is probably a little bit more significant, and it came in the form of Ballot Measure 109. And Oregon did a couple of kind of cool and interesting things, and this is one of them. So the good people at OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting, Oregon Public Media put together these cool little explainers, and they have graphics and they dance and they're really pretty. So let's take a look at that about Measure 109.
This is where Ballot Measure 109 comes in. If passed, it would give Oregon 2 years to set up a system that licenses, regulates, taxes, and eventually allows the manufacture and use of psilocybin, but only in special facilities and under professional supervision. As written, anyone 21 or older, after some screening, could get a session, though the details of who could provide psilocybin therapy and under what conditions would be determined later. In other words, the measure creates a framework to allow the use of psilocybin.
Interesting. Psilocybin, magical mushrooms. Now, I was both heartened by this news. I'm like, oh, well, that's good news for people who have perhaps, different problems, mental health issues. Psilocybin has been researched thoroughly, despite the fact being used for many thousands of years by indigenous cultures around the world. Now America's like, oh, we've been doing the research, and did you know this is helpful for this, and this? And all the indigenous people are like, yes, dummies, yes, we've been doing that shit. I'm curious, NORML. I know you guys generally focus on reformation of marijuana laws. Do you have a position on medicinal mushrooms and the usage and the passage and decriminalization of those as well?
Yeah, so I mean, NORML as an organization doesn't typically take positions on drugs beyond marijuana, but I mean, I personally think that, similar to medical marijuana, any kind of medical treatment, whether that includes psilocybin or something else, is something that should be decided between a patient and their doctor, and it's not something that, law enforcement or politicians or the government should be involved in. So, while NORML may not take an official position on this, I personally would support medical access to any treatment that, there's research to support, and there is for psilocybin and also for medical marijuana. And I think now at this point in 2020, just the argument of, oh, well, there's just not enough research yet, I think that's invalid and unacceptable. So I personally am glad to see Oregon moving forward, and I think the possession of drugs shouldn't be a criminal justice issue anymore. It should just be a public health issue. And, these drugs aren't going anywhere. People are going to use them whether they're legal or not. So it might as well be regulated in a way that's safe and accessible to people who need it.
And at this point, we're looking at 2/3 of the country with some form of medicinal or recreational laws on the books, or some sort of, infrastructure in place to have recreational sales. I mean, how much longer can the federal government sort of deny the legality, or at minimum, the decriminalization of marijuana. There's been some talk from the Biden-Harris folks that they are considering decriminalizing it at the federal level, which of course the president has the authority to do. I was very disappointed that Barack Obama did not take the opportunity to do exactly that while he was president. But the states are lapping the federal government on this. As we look ahead to what the future of legalized marijuana could look like, do you think the feds are going to come around, or is it going to take the 45th, 46th, 47th, 48th, 49th state to pass legalized marijuana in some form before the feds finally be like, oh, everyone else is doing it, maybe we should be part of this group too?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I'm glad you brought that up, because actually we got news a couple of weeks ago that there actually is a federal bill in the House, which NORML had worked on and had been advocating for a while now. It's called the MORE Act. It would remove marijuana from the Federal Controlled Substances Act, which would essentially end the national prohibition. And that is supposed to get voted on in the House of Representatives, which would be really historic, because that's obviously never happened before. So that's something that, the House of Representatives, the leadership has verbally committed to. It hasn't been scheduled yet, but we're hoping that, they keep their word and actually bring this bill for a vote in the House, even though if Mitch McConnell is still leading the Senate in 2021, there's not much hope for it. But actually, I am optimistic for federal reform, especially because Vice President-elect Kamala Harris is actually the lead sponsor for the MORE Act in the Senate. So I'm hoping that maybe she can just nudge Joe Biden a little further left, and maybe instead of just decriminalizing it, which is not quite enough, that maybe she can nudge him in the direction of full legalization. So I think we're cautiously optimistic of federal reform, but I think unless things change in the Senate, that hope kind of dwindles a little bit.
Well, Carly, before we let you go, still doing some looking ahead here in terms of what the next states potentially could be that could go either medicinal or full-on legalization. And I believe this was yesterday. It was Virginia Governor Ralph Northam, while giving his daily coronavirus briefing, dropped some news that, he has long been an advocate of decriminalizing marijuana, which Virginia did, I believe, earlier this year. But he is full on in support of legalization. Dwayne, let's take a look at that package.
Governor Ralph Northam says he wants a responsible approach to legalizing the recreational use of marijuana, one that promotes racial equity and protects youth and the environment. Dr. Abu Abubakar lost his adult son Adam 6 years ago after he became addicted to prescription drugs, then heroin.
Cigarettes and alcohol and prescription medications are much more definitive way to drug or hard drugs than in marijuana.
Abubakar says legalization could clear the path to more studies on the benefits of the drug, but says, like alcohol, the industry should be strictly regulated and off limits to youth.
The only thing that I would say is that hopefully we'll have strict regulations of where it's sold and who sells it.
When it comes to the racial component, a joint legislative audit and review commission found that while black and white Virginians use marijuana at similar rates, black state residents are 3.5 times more likely to face arrest.
They count 3-to-1 racial disparity right now. I think it's higher than that. There's an incredible racial disparity problem.
John Shinholzer founded the McShin Foundation, a recovery program in Henrico County. He supports the legalization of marijuana.
And what I've seen, since I started this recovery organization, the people who smoke pot, they do less damage to themselves in the community than the ones that do opiate, benzos, and alcohol.
But opponents, including Smart Approaches to Marijuana, a Virginia-based group, says the legalization of marijuana could result in the creation of an addiction-for-profit industry that targets minorities and young people.
That was our fear back in the day.
Once afraid that marijuana was a gateway drug, Ed and Debbie Rosenbaum say they have a change of heart now that their son is a recovered alcoholic.
But I feel like it's a step in the right direction, and I feel like it's just a matter of time before we all decide that this is the lesser. And it's all about harm reduction, I think.
Well, the governor hopes to introduce legislation to legalize marijuana in this year's General Assembly session. While legislators voted last year to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of marijuana, it's unclear whether this legislation could gather the same support.
Now, for everyone that's watching outside of the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, let me just assure you, Virginia decriminalizing weed and potentially legalizing marijuana is a BFD, because everyone in Maryland and DC who is carrying any weed is paranoid as shit when they drive into Virginia, because they know we call them the Virginia Stormtroopers. The Virginia State Troopers also do not fuck around on 395 and 95. And if they catch you holding anything, at least pre this decriminalization law, you were a goner. And so this is a relief to everyone who traverses up and down I-95 that Virginia is taking this completely progressive stance, which you would not have been able to tell me 20 years ago that Virginia would have been headed in this direction. So, Carly, what other states could also be looming on the horizon to make that flip into either medicinal or full-on recreational legalized marijuana use?
Yeah, I mean, I'm super excited about Virginia. Like you said, being in DC, right across the river. So I'm glad to see that happen. And actually, our Virginia NORML folks were super instrumental in that process. So it's nice to see that their work paying off too. But as far as 2021, I'm looking at a lot of northeastern states. I think since New Jersey finally pulled the trigger, I think that states like New York, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, hopefully, will kind of follow their lead and move forward with legalization next year. I know Maryland has been working on a legalization bill for the past couple of years now. So I'm really looking at them for next year as well. Also, some states on the West, like New Mexico, they had advanced legalization bills in the past, but hadn't quite gotten the support they needed to pass it. And I think after the elections this year, prospects there are looking better. New Mexico's governor has been super supportive of the issue. So I'm looking at those few states. For medical marijuana, we hope to see some more southern states come online, like Alabama, like South Carolina. So I will definitely be tracking legislation in those states. And if anyone watching is interested in keeping up with some of those efforts, you can follow NORML on social media. Check out our website if you want to find a chapter that's in your area. So definitely we'll keep you posted as those efforts advance and come to fruition, hopefully next year.
Well, Carly, I appreciate you making some time to bring us up to speed on the different ways in different states where marijuana continues to pick up momentum. And I hope that the states keep you busy in your position as a state policies coordinator for NORML, because at some point this whole country has got to be green. I mean, it's green any damn way, right? So might as well make it official.
Right. Well, thanks so much for having me on. This was great.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Y'all, Carly Wolf from NORML. Go and follow NORML on social media so you can stay up to speed and abreast of the different policy comings and goings at the state level pertaining to marijuana legalization. Carly, we appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
All righty. Well, gang, as we move along in the conversation, you know, it's awesome that weed and other things are being decriminalized. And while I'm talking about decriminalization, actually, Dwayne, before we bring Neill on, Neill, I know you're standing by. Hold what you got for about 60 more seconds. Dwayne, could you please play That Is V1? So y'all, when I tell y'all that Oregon did like some major things like the mushrooms, okay, that's cool, even though they're not available for recreational sales. Boo for that. I was sort of hoping, I'm like, ooh, can you order mushrooms now from Oregon? No, you cannot order mushrooms from Oregon. So temper your expectations, Kim Brown. But what Oregon did that is really, really groundbreaking is that they decriminalized small amounts of all drugs, even the big, bad, hard drugs that people go down for years and years and years for. This was incredibly progressive and impressive. And of course, like I said, the good people at Oregon Public Broadcasting did a nice explainer about Measure 110. Dwayne, let's take a look.
The measure has two main parts. First, it would create a new $57 million fund meant to pay for new addiction recovery centers around the state. The centers would provide 24/7 access to assessment, triage, intervention, and case management. And the money would come from existing taxes on recreational cannabis, some of which would be shifted from schools and existing treatment programs. Second, the measure would change possession of small amounts of controlled substances like cocaine, heroin, and LSD from a misdemeanor to a Class E violation. That means that instead of facing large fines, probation, and potentially jail time, a person caught using drugs would face a $100 fine, which could be waived if they report to one of the newly created treatment centers for a substance abuse assessment. Just to be clear, manufacturing drugs or possessing with intent to distribute to others would still be a crime. And federal drug laws would still apply, though feds rarely get involved with personal possession cases. Supporters of Measure 110 say treating drug use as a medical condition is a more effective and humane approach than putting drug users in jail. A state analysis estimates that convictions for possessing drugs would drop from just over 4,000 in 2019 to less than 400 a year.
That's cool, right? Progressive. I'd like to bring in our next guest now. He's a friend of the show, even though this is his first time being on this show, I believe, but we're happy to see him again. Neill Franklin. Neill is the executive director for Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Neill has lots of years in law enforcement. He retired as a major with over 34 years of being a police veteran, and he's led multi-jurisdictional anti-narcotics task force for the Maryland State Police and ran training centers for the Baltimore Police Department. But Neill, he's on some next stuff now, and he's here with us today. Neill, we appreciate you making some time. Thank you so much.
Anytime, Kim.
Neill, when you hear about what Oregon was able to pass this election day, that sounds tremendously exciting. And do you know what it brought me in the mind frame of? And I know you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. A former mayor of Baltimore City of yore, long ago, his name was Kurt Schmoke. Kurt Schmoke said this back in the 1980s, that it was time to decriminalize all drugs, at least small amounts of drugs, to address the mass incarceration problem facing Black and Brown communities. And they laughed Kurt Schmoke ass up out the building when Kurt Schmoke said that. And here we are some 30-some years later, and look at this. The state of Oregon is doing something that is not only groundbreaking, but hopefully will be emulated. What's your take on this?
Well, first of all, Kurt Schmoke was a great influence to my process, right? To my moving away from this criminal approach to one of health, to one of decriminalization. And I always say decriminalizing the people, not so much the drugs, right? And so he's been very important to my journey. We still stay in touch. We still do a lot of communication. We do some occasional writing together on this particular topic. But this is great. Oregon is taking that very important first step. And notice I said first step because we still have a long way to go. We have to get to a place of flat out ending prohibition. So Oregon is taking a similar approach to what Portugal has done, close to, and they began their decriminalizing the people who use drugs. They began about, I think, 16, 17 years ago, and they have had and demonstrated great success in this. In many different ways, mainly with a continued decline in drug use in their country, abuse of drugs in their countries. So yeah, I mean, first Oregon, all right, who's next?
Well, who is next? I think that's a very valid and fair question. But part of the reason I wanted to have you join this conversation, Neill, is because data has borne out that despite the fact legalization is making strides in many places across the country, the disparities in arrest for drugs along racial lines very much still exist. The Washington Post, Paul Schwartzman, John D. Harden, they wrote about this back in September. Dwayne, I think we have that piece, but what they said was, I'm going to paraphrase here. It says the police in Washington, D.C. are far more likely to arrest Blacks than whites for marijuana-related offenses. This is 5 years after the city enacted reforms that proponents hope would end racial disparities in law enforcement. Although marijuana arrests have declined by more than half, African Americans still amount for just under 90% of those arrested on all pot-related charges, according to a Washington Post analysis, even as they make up just 45% of the city's population. And Neill, you know, as far as America goes, like Washington is a so-called progressive place. So you know if that's happening in the District of Columbia, those racial disparities, despite that law being on the books, it is absolutely happening in those sort of numbers in other places too, where marijuana is decriminalized or outright legalized. Why? if the law is on the books, why are police still deliberately messing with Black people about marijuana?
So here's a misconception, because whether we're talking about DC, whether we're talking about Colorado or any other state that has moved forward with legalizing marijuana, the disparities remain. So the disparities aren't about drugs and drugs relative to the criminal justice system. The disparities are about race, period. Because whether we're talking drugs, whether we're talking disorderly conduct, failure to obey, trespassing, you name it, the disparity rates for arrest are always higher with Black folks in this country from coast to coast. This is a race issue. This isn't about drug policy. So we got to deal with race in this country if we want a more fair justice system in this country. So that's what we're dealing with. But the good thing is that because of the overall aggregate numbers, the raw numbers have declined dramatically. It does mean that fewer Black folks are being arrested for well, in Oregon now, it's going to be drug possession as a whole. But in these states that have moved forward with ending the prohibition of marijuana, at least we have fewer people being put in handcuffs, fewer Black people. But it's a race issue, first and foremost.
And that's horrifying because at least outwardly, most politicians, and this is a bipartisan issue, really, Neill, because nobody's interested in defunding the police except for the people in the streets and the activists and the organizers and people who are directly being affected by these policies. But the Democrats don't seem to have a stomach for defunding the police. In fact, South Carolina Congressman James Clyburn was scolding people for even using defund the police as a phrase during the campaign, claiming that it cost some candidates their potentially their seats. I know he was speaking directly about the Democratic Senate candidate in South Carolina. But
let me tell you something, Kim.
Tell me something, Neil.
Let me tell you 2 quick points. Number one, even conservatives are moving toward defunding the police. It's the term that has been chosen that is the problem. And here's what I mean, because I've yet to meet anyone, progressive, conservative, or in the middle, that doesn't agree with moving resources into a place of public health, mental health. Everyone that I speak to, left, right, in between, supports reducing the footprint of policing within our communities. That means getting the right responders to mental health issues, the right responders to address drug addiction in our communities, the right people, and sometimes we refer to them as community responders, to deal with the things in our neighborhoods and in our communities that the police don't need to be dealing with, right? Again, getting the police out of our schools. Now, not relative to, the threat of these school shootings that we have, but even the police believe and understand that, wait a minute, we shouldn't be dealing with issues in our schools that the administrator should be handling, of problematic kids. And a lot of these kids are dealing with mental health issues. So it's not an issue for the police. And again, the police are now finally coming around to the fact that we don't need to be involved in, issues of drug addiction. However, many of them still have a difficult time accepting the fact that marijuana is now moving in the direction it should move in, all right, for ending prohibition. And it's mainly marijuana because they know that marijuana is the one drug, is the one thing that gets them into your pockets, into your cars, into your homes to search for other things like guns and fruits of other crimes. So they don't want to lose that marijuana and its distinct odor that allows them to search you at their will. So that defunding the police term is just a messaging problem, an issue, right? But what we're really talking about is getting the police out of health, mental health, business, and any other thing that we can get them out of within our communities, and give that responsibility to other folks within our communities. It means we're shrinking the footprint of policing in our neighborhoods. And therefore, at the end of the day, you're talking about a shifting of resources from policing back into the communities and those community support groups and grassroots organizations that are doing the very important and good work in our communities.
Well, Neill, I'm pretty sure that you don't not support defund the police. And I hear that argument made about, well, it's the same argument almost that James Clyburn made about sloganeering, and this is like the wrong phrasing of this. But to push back, we consistently, year after year, in states and cities across this country, we hear about educational budgets being slashed. We hear about public health budgets being slashed, and nobody bats an eye when we say defund the schools or defund the hospitals or defund public health. But for some reason, defund the police is the phrase that touched that flashpoint amongst a lot of people. I won't even say for people who are pro-police, but a lot of people who don't fully understand the concepts behind defund and abolition, and how there are well thought out plans and strategies in place about what to do and how to replace the police in certain services that they provide, and certain services that they are already not great at. What is your take on that?
Let me give you a quick analogy. Here's an analogy.
Yes, sir.
Right? If you go back with our organization, LEAP, if you go back 15 years, we were saying legalize all drugs. People 15 years ago, when you used that term, legalize all drugs, legalize marijuana, people were falling out of their chairs. I mean, people had a serious issue with the term legalize. But over the years, what happened was an educational process, right? Laying it out. What does that truly mean? What it really means is ending the prohibition of drugs. What it really means is we're no longer going to criminalize people who are using these drugs. What it really means, we need to move to a model that's similar to tobacco and alcohol, and let's end this madness. But 15, 20 years ago, you use that term legalize, you're lucky you didn't get shot in the street. We got persecuted. Our organization was persecuted. But look at it now, right? Everyone's using the term, oh, well, it's legalized marijuana. We should have done this, decades ago. So you know what? 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when people begin to understand what the abolition of police means and what it looks like, oh, defund the police. Well, wow, we should have done that 20 years ago. It's an educational process, but unfortunately, that term, just like legalize, doesn't sit well with a lot of people today. So we got to educate folks. We got to give them that vision of what it looks like to abolish the police. And abolishing the police is not a bad thing. It's a good thing when you understand the concept. But we got a long way to go, and you gotta grab their hand, you gotta hold their hand, you gotta walk them down the sidewalk and show them what it looks like.
Neill, as marijuana specifically becomes more legally acceptable nationwide, and hopefully with ballot measures like which recently passed in Oregon, hopefully, pick up steam and go a bunch of places across the country, and a lot of places hopefully will follow suit. To me, that's also sort of going towards the defund the police and abolish the police sort of policies, because if you make these things legal, then you give the cops less things to do, right? And you gotta give
Absolutely.
police.
Look, here, I've always said that if I were the commissioner of not just the Baltimore Police Department, but any police department across this country, I could cut my police budget tomorrow, literally by 10%. And that could go back into our neighborhoods and communities. I mean, that's serious. Tomorrow, I would end these drug units, right? I don't need in a 3,000 person police department. I don't need 1/10 of my department working drugs, working undercover, doing these jump outs and all this stuff. That goes away. I'll focus on violent crime. So if you're out there in the game, committing the shootings and the stabbings and all the nonsense that goes with that, I'll go after you for that. But right off the bat, I'd end my drug unit, division, bureau, whatever you want to call it. And that's at least at minimum 10% of that budget that I can put back into the community for these things that we're talking about. And let me say something else, Kim, I hear people talking about this move towards ending prohibition, legalization, decriminalization, people talking about it as a progressive stance and not a conservative stance. It's more conservative than progressive, because we're talking about, number one, especially what we're seeing with marijuana state by state, you're talking about states' rights, right? Mm-hmm. That's conservative. You're talking about smaller government, less expensive government. That's conservative, mainly more maybe libertarian, but it's conservative. It's a conservative principle. So all of this stuff that we're talking about regarding drug policy and ending prohibition, legalization, shrinking government, less expensive government, giving people their freedoms. Look how people the conservatives are just having a rough time dealing with their lack of freedom when it comes to wearing a mask during a pandemic, right? So this is a conservative principle more than anything else. And this is something else that we have to get people to understand, mainly those folks in the South, in Florida, in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Georgia, to understand that this is a conservative principle. But for some reason, everybody thinks it's from the left and progressive, but it's not. It's just like conservatives support legalized booze. You better believe they do. They don't want to see the banning of of tobacco products or any of that stuff. They want to have the freedom to use what they want to use. And tobacco, nicotine, alcohol, they're drugs, and they're very problematic drugs too.
But it's about the application of the law, right? I mean, we see this in so many different ways, Neill. Like, and I know that white folk do what black folk cannot do, right? White people can ride around dirty, all the drugs, cocaine on the dashboard, open container in the passenger seat, and like wave at the police as they drive by. And the brother, if he got a tail light out, whoop, whoop, we got to get out the car, let's step outside, let me search you. I think I smell marijuana. Like it, I hear you, but the conservatives don't. As long as the police are enforcing the Negroes and keeping the Negroes and the indigenous and the brown people in their place, the conservatives are like, well, yeah, we over here enjoying our drugs. How come y'all not enjoying y'all's? Oh, you didn't comply. Oh, well, that's y'all's fault.
Goes back to the beginning of our conversation. Race. That's
100%.
Center of the wheel. Race.
The last question I'm going to ask you, and I hope don't be mad, because I hope it's not too lengthy of a question before I let you go. I mean, but when we talk about I know you told me. I mean, it's impossible to reform police in its current state. Is that right, Neill? Because as you mentioned, no matter what the law is on the books, the police, the target of police actions is always going to be the Black and brown folks, no matter what the laws are. So
you're 100% correct.
No way to reform that. So what do you do with that?
You have to look. I think we understand that, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, we're not going to get to a place of police abolition. So what do we do in the interim as we begin to move in that direction? Like you said, we cannot appropriately reform the current model of policing in this country, because the current model of policing in this country was designed for the detriment of Black folks. Coming out of slave patrols in the South, protection of property in the North, it was all about the rich and their property, whether that was inanimate objects or whether it was human beings in the form of slavery. It was all about property. That model of policing is the same model of policing that we have today. It doesn't work for Black folks in this country. We need a new model. We need a new paradigm. We need to work from the ground up in building that new model of policing that is fair, inclusive to everyone, Black folks, the various cultures that we have, gay, straight, all of that. We need to take all of that into account when we build this new model of policing in this country. And it's not very difficult to do. The one department that has come closest to doing that is Camden, New Jersey. They literally, for financial reasons, they literally disbanded their police department and somewhat rebuilt it. And it was a struggle going forward on the other side, but with the community's involvement, they eventually got to a place where that police department is not perfect, nowhere near perfect, but it's probably 50 to 75% better than what it was. And those officers who currently work in that police department will not tolerate, at least today, they will not tolerate police officers who go against the current culture, which is a culture that embraces the community and works very close with the community in deciding what is best for that community, right? Again, it's not perfect, but it demonstrates that you can dismantle a police department and rebuild it, reconstruct it within a very short period of time to how you want it to be. The key on the other side of that rebuilding of the police department is that the community needs to lead the restructuring of the police department, not the government, not police, not anyone else. It needs to be a community neighborhood collaborative on the other side who is leading the way in controlling the philosophy, the budget, hiring and firing of the leader, the police chief or commissioner, whatever you want to call them. That's how we change the model, this current model that has been born out of slave patrols and protecting the property of the rich.
Perfect point to leave the conversation at. We've been speaking with Neill Franklin. Neill is the Executive Director of Law Enforcement
Action
Partnership. Leap. I had it in my house practicing, and then as soon as it came out of my mouth, I was like, oops, I forgot it. Neill, I'd like to have you back in the future because we're going to do a conversation about abolition, police and prison abolition, because I know a lot of people have questions, right? They hear defund the police, they hear abolish the police. They could get behind it, but they don't understand what the future on the other side of these policy proposals look like. So I'd love to have you on to join us again when we have that conversation, because I think your voice would be very, very important and your perspective would be extremely valuable. So
it would be my pleasure. And now I've been a prison abolitionist for quite a while, actually. So yeah, would love to.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Neill Franklin, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate you stopping by here, Neill.
Take care, Kim.
Thank you. You take care as well. I'd like to thank our other guest tonight, Carly Wolf, State Policies Coordinator for NORML. This was a fun conversation. Would y'all say? I would say so. Before we go, I want to read off some of the comments in the comments. I see that y'all are back in the comments. That's wonderful. Black Magic says, currently, the drug, cannabis, opioid problem is such a white issue. They get rehab and not jail, but they are still arresting Black folks and incarcerating them. Absolutely. No, the whole, listen, where was the whole talk about rehabilitation during the crack era? They was just like, oh, crackheads, ew, gross. Y'all are horrible people. But opioid addiction is like, oh, these people are so troubled. They need help. Yes, the crack addicts also needed the exact same help. Sparky Sparks It Up. Hi, Sparky Sparks It Up. I like that name. Okay. Sparky Sparks It Up says they can't stop anyone from using anything. You can't stop free will. This is facts, y'all. Listen, people have been consuming mind-altering substances since the beginning of time. This is a whole Western concept to fuck with people behind shit that grows out of the ground, right? That people have been cultivating for a very long time. All this is relatively recent. Afra sings. Hello, Afra. Thank you so much for watching. Afra says, not just social justice, but racial justice. Black and brown people have been most severely impacted by the criminal punishment policies of the BS drug wars. Absolutely. Yes, we have, y'all. I mean, Afra, you grew up in this area, DC area. Neill representing from Baltimore. I'm from Central Maryland. Listen, crack was doing terrible things to Baltimore and Washington, DC. Well, mainly crack was in DC, heroin was in Baltimore, and it was horrible, ravaging communities in bad, bad ways. But the mass incarceration problem that followed did not ameliorate the problem. So now, in retrospect, we have to think better policies, better ways to do this, better ways of going forward, and accepting the fact that people are going to take drugs is the biggest thing that we can do. Acceptance is the first part of the process. But listen, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in, watching us today. Last reminder, don't forget, go to the other YouTube channel, Burn It Down with Kim Brown. We got to get those subscribers up. So do me a favor, please go there and subscribe, okay? Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Listen, we will see y'all Friday. We're going to have a great show for you planned on Friday. And I appreciate y'all hanging out with me. Thanks again to Neill and Carly. And thanks to everyone that helps work on the show. Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Kelly, Adam, James, whoever else. Have a good evening, y'all. See you later. Bye. Bye.